All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So our parasha this week is called B'MIDBAR. Can you say that with me? B'MIDBAR. Perfect. And it means in the wilderness. This is the first section in the book of Numbers. So now we're entering into a new book. And now we're finally going to see Israel leave Mount Sinai and the Sinai wilderness and start heading towards the promised land. So first, let's just take a step back and see the big picture of what's happening in the Torah. If you remember in Genesis, God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. Great promise. However, they went down to Egypt because there was a famine and they stayed there. In Exodus, they became slaves in Egypt. So God called them out and brought them into the wilderness at Mount Sinai. And here, he instructed them and told them how to live when they enter the promised land. While they were here, he also told them to build the tabernacle. Why? So he can dwell with them. However, when we get to the end of Exodus, we run into a problem. You see, God is in the tabernacle, he's in the tent of meeting, but Moses cannot enter because God's glory is too great. That's where Leviticus comes in, the next book. Time doesn't really pass in Leviticus, but here we just have a lot of instructions. Why? To build that bridge, to show how we can dwell with God. The book of Leviticus tells us how to remain ritually and morally pure. And now finally, we come to Numbers. And in Numbers, the first sentence in that whole book shows us that the problem has been solved. It says that the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting, showing us that Moses can now dwell in God's presence. So as we open up the book of Numbers, we see that Israel is spiritually prepared to enter into the promised land. Now we're going to see them physically start marching there. Now, we're not entirely sure where Mount Sinai is. Some people say it's one place, some people say another. Wherever you place it, we know the general region, and it takes about 4 to 5 days from where they were to enter into Canaan. However, let me ask you, did they enter Canaan in 4 to 5 days? No. As we spoke about last week, we see the story where they get to the border of Canaan, to the border of the promised land. God says, enter, and they say, no. The people are too scary. They did not trust in God's revelation. And for that reason, God sent them back into the wilderness for 40 years as judgment. The book of Numbers could have been a happily ever after story, where they enter in, they obey, and they live in God's presence. Instead, it recounts the judgment that they endured for 40 years. Now, this 40 years in the wilderness becomes a type of training ground for Israel. As we follow their story, we're going to see many trials from the outside, where armies attack them and they need to fight them off, to struggles on the inside, where people rebel against the leadership and want to take over Moses' position. And what we notice in Numbers is that in the midst of every trial and every difficulty, just like for you and I today, there are always two paths to take. The path to accept God's revelation and to trust, or the path to rebel, which leads to consequences. The first path helps grow our faith. Like we see, we're going to see the story where the bronze serpent is put up, and all of the Israelites, they're sick, and they have to look up at that serpent, and they will be healed. That grows their faith, and that becomes a type of the Messiah. Or we see the rebellion, where even the Levites try to take over Moses' position. There's always these two paths. And as we note, when you look at the book of Numbers, and this is what I love about it, it's not that everybody is righteous, or some people are always righteous and some people are always wicked. Instead, what we see is that people who were once faithful, like Moses, sometimes rebel against God by striking the rock. Or you have people who are rebellious against God at one point, like Aaron, who later become a faithful leader, showing that your path can change. And so the book of Numbers is a good reminder, first, of the graciousness of God. That whatever rebellion we've had in our past, the Lord is faithful to restore us. We could always take that path of obedience starting this morning. Today is a new beginning. The book of Numbers is also a warning. Just like Paul, remember when he wrote to the church in Corinth, and he said, let him or let anyone who stands or who thinks he stands take heed, be cautious, because you could easily fall. No one is above temptation. No one is above becoming proud and thinking they're independent. So the book of Numbers is a constant warning to stay on that vigilant path in obedience to God. So as we turn to our parasha for this morning, looking at Numbers 1 all the way through chapter 4, we see, again, Israel, they're getting ready to leave Mount Sinai and head towards Canaan, head towards the promised land. If you've ever been up late at night and you've been wondering, why is the book of Numbers called Numbers? We're about to find out. You see, because prior to leaving Sinai, God told Moses and Aaron, take a census, take account of everybody 20 years and older. That way we know the amount of people who could fight in the military. So they went to each tribe and they did that, which is why it's called Numbers. However, one tribe was left out of the census. Does anyone know what tribe that was? Very good, the Levites. And on the one hand, we may think, great, lucky Levites, right? They don't have to fight in the war. But what we learn is that the Levites were set apart for a different but equally important task. Their function was to take care of the tabernacle. They would dwell around the tabernacle. When you think of the Levites, I want you to think that they were like guards for the holiness of God. They protected the center, the presence of God, from any ritual impurity that would come so he could remain with them. They also were the representatives of the people. They were the bridge. They represented the people before God so people could pray and have a relationship with the Lord. And this gives us a beautiful picture of Yeshua, our heavenly high priest, and what he does for us today. Now, while there are many things to learn from this parasha, there's one important reminder that I want to bring up before we enter into our time of worship together. And that important reminder is that everybody has a calling. Everybody has a purpose and a function. You see, Israel, they were set apart. Israel was set apart from the nations, and they were brought out to be God's people. But when you zoom in, you start seeing that different tribes had different functions. And if you zoom in even more, and I would encourage you, read through this parasha, you're going to see that even in the tribe of Levi, different families had different responsibilities. And in the same way, you and I today are generally called to come and know the Lord, to grow in the Lord, and to grow in sanctification. But when you zoom in a little bit more, we also see that each of us have specific gifts and callings that the Lord has given to you in order to build up the kingdom of God. Whether that's serving or teaching or leadership, this parasha reminds us, don't blend in the background. Every number counts. Every gift counts. Instead, we need to be proactive in discovering our gifts so that we can serve the kingdom. So as we stand together and as we sing and approach the Lord, let us pursue our calling diligently, like the priests, to draw closer to his presence and fulfill our mission to be a light to the world.